really delighted to see you, but I can't see any of you. So I'll just say that I'm delighted that you're here and that you're interested in the issue of preschool through third grade coherence. So I think most of you know that the research on the effects of preschool has shown that investments in early childhood education don't always yield the long-term academic benefits that we hope for. So many studies have shown that the advantages that we see of experiencing preschool erode over the first few grades of elementary school. This is referred to as fade out, as I'm sure you've heard of. This reduction in benefits is caused in part by the disconnect between what children experience in third grade and what they experience in the following grades. So to sustain the benefits of preschool, we really need to invest in the grades that follow preschool, and we need to create coherence in children's learning experience as they move from grade to grade. Now, sometimes people refer to this as P3 alignment, sometimes P3 coherence, sometimes P3 continuity. It all means the same thing, which I'll talk a little bit more about. So what do we mean by P3 alignment or coherence? The way my colleagues and I describe it is it's providing children with a seamless and effective educational experience that sustains the gains they made in preschool and improves developmental and learning outcomes overall. Now, notice that I included the word effective. It is very possible to have continuity of bad instruction, so that children get bad instruction and the same bad instruction every year. This is not what we're working toward. We're working toward continuity of instruction, but also effective strategies, effective instruction. So we want children's experience to look more like the top arrow in that picture than in the bottom arrow. So how do we achieve this goal? First, it's really important that each grade builds on the skills that children developed in the previous grade. Children learn best when instruction is aimed just a little bit beyond what they already know. If children repeat what they've learned, they obviously don't learn more. If they're asked to engage in instruction that is way beyond their prerequisite skill levels, then they're not going to learn very much. So the evidence suggests that the former, the repetition is fairly common. There's research on a nationally representative sample of kindergartens that showed that kindergarten teachers frequently taught children the same skills that they had already mastered when they entered the kindergarten classroom. And not surprisingly, the research also showed that the more overlap there was between the instruction in kindergarten with the instruction and mastery achieved in preschool, the less children learned in kindergarten. Now, this is not to say that review is not useful. It can be very useful, but most of the research suggests that review, especially in mathematics, is used much more than is necessary or really productive. Secondly, we also need to pay attention to what is taught, not just to how math is taught, not just what is taught. So continuity in the nature of instruction across the grades is also useful. And I'm going to illustrate this with two classrooms. One classroom looks quite different from the other. The instruction is what some would refer to as very traditional, very focused on getting right answers. Kids are not using the manipulatives. They're doing a lot of worksheets and paper and pencil activities. The teacher is stressing getting the right answer. The teacher focuses on the correctness of the answer. Speed is sometimes emphasized. Now I want you to contrast that with a very different vision of effective math instruction, one where manipulatives are common and very available for children to use when they want to model a problem. Children frequently work in pairs or in small groups. The teacher asks children to figure out different ways to solve problems on their own or maybe with a classmate. the teacher asks children to explain how they found their answer. How'd you get that? Or why an answer is correct. That's right, but how do you know? How can you be sure? The teacher emphasizes not necessarily solving problems correctly, although ultimately we want kids to know how to solve problems correctly, but really emphasizes understanding the mathematics behind the problem. Speed is not terribly important, although fluency is a core skill that needs to be developed. And assessment is embedded in the everyday practice. So I want you to imagine a child moving from classroom A, teaching that looks like classroom A, to the next grade, teaching that looks like classroom B. I've seen this, and we often see children saying, the teacher won't tell us how to solve these problems. And they're frustrated because that's what they're used to. Or when the teacher says, is there another way to solve that problem? They think they must have gotten it wrong because the only time their teacher in the previous grade asked them if there was another way to solve it, it was because they had it wrong. This is disconcerting for children. Teaching approaches that are similar across grades give children a sense of familiarity and self-confidence. Teaching that is different means that teachers have to actually waste a lot of time in teaching children a different way of doing math. Now, it's probably obvious to you that most researchers endorse what I've referred to as the kind of teaching that's in classroom B. And I also want to add that teaching with similar methods doesn't mean you're teaching the same thing. You're obviously teaching very different things as children progress through the grades, but there are similar strategies being used along the lines as described here that are familiar to children. So clearly what matters most is what happens in the classroom, but fostering instructional coherence across grades also requires a system of support that is aligned and mutually reinforcing. So in our research on districts that are endeavoring to both improve the effectiveness and the coherence from preschool through third grade, we've identified 6 elements that are critical to supporting instructional coherence. So I'm going to explain each of these elements, and then I'm going to, on each slide, there are a list of questions, and the questions are just useful to ask. It helps guide decisions about what does the district or the organization need to do to make sure that it's likely that they're going to see effective and coherent teaching across these grades. Now, I'm going to talk about districts primarily because most of my work is with districts, but it's any organization that is trying to create some coherence, trying to make sure that the gains that children make in preschool are capitalized on and promote further benefits in their learning. And it could be going from Head Start into elementary school, from a state pre-K into elementary school. It's harder to do when the preschool is not directly connected to the elementary school, but there are ways in which it can be done. So let me start with the first element, which I'm going to refer to as an instructional framework. So instructional frameworks provide guidance on both what to teach, it's the content, but also how to teach, the pedagogical approaches. This is an articulated vision that guides the selection of curricula, the assessments that are used, the way coaches work with teachers, and so on. Most districts rely on the state standards for the answer to the question of what to teach. Some districts actually, within the district, make priorities or provide additional guidelines to teachers, not always. In terms of how to teach, sometimes, actually in many districts, the how to teach is implicit in the curriculum that's selected. So there's no really district articulated vision. But if they have a very traditional curriculum, then it's likely to look more like classroom A. So implicit is the vision that is, I think, created by that description. one district we studied developed what they called an instructional practice guide. It's an observation tool that specifies core mathematical teaching practices across the grade levels. It was used in so many different ways to make sure that everyone in the district was familiar with the vision the district had of effective mathematics teaching. It was used in district leadership walkthroughs, in teacher professional development, in teacher evaluations, and so on. So it basically was the guide so that anyone who was looking at instruction was asking themselves, does it look like what has been articulated in the district vision? And I really want to emphasize that a framework for how instruction should work in this district is only effective if everybody knows it and if there are processes to make sure that it's implemented and used across the district. Another element of support that teachers require to provide a coherent and effective math instructional program concerns the materials and pedagogical approaches that are used. So one of the questions that you can ask yourself is, do the curricula you use in each grade, preschool through third, build on the previous grade? You don't want a kindergarten curriculum that repeats most of what children had already learned in preschool. Where we typically see the biggest gap is between preschool and kindergarten. And that's partly because commercial curricula don't, for the most part, go preschool through the early elementary grades. And so they may go to a completely different place to get the preschool curriculum. But at the very least, you want to check to make sure that there is continuity and that the kindergarten curriculum picks up where the preschool curriculum left off rather than overlaps, except for perhaps just a little. Are there common high leverage instructional practices across the grades? Now in math, there are a variety of practices that can be used across grades that can become very familiar to students and that we know through research are high leverage practices. They're effective in teaching children deep understanding. Examples are using word problems, counting collections, math talks, choral counting. There's a series of them, and it's useful to adopt some of these in the instructional framework and to make sure that they are being used preschool through third grade and maybe beyond. Then the question is, what's the relationship between these curricula, these instructional practices, and the curriculum? Now, I have seen in a number of cases teachers going to professional development where they're told to listen to student thinking, to differentiate instruction within their class according to students' thinking and understandings. But then they go back to their classroom where they have a very traditional, very didactic curriculum with a rigid pacing guide. So they've got, on the one hand, they're learning how to teach math one way, but the curriculum really imposes to some degree another way. We spend a lot of time in our work with teachers helping them work around the curriculum, adapt the curriculum to be able to implement the effective teaching strategies that we know. But it's a lot easier if the curriculum and the teaching strategies teachers are being taught actually cohere and are consistent. Third element in the framework is student assessments. And there's really two purposes for student assessments. If teachers are supposed to build on what children know and understand, then they need to know what children know and understand, and they need tools for this. Now, the formative assessment tools that teachers can use are often built into the curriculum. That's a good thing because that means that they're assessing children fairly regularly on the material that is being taught at that time, so that teachers have an opportunity to check, how many or who got this and who didn't, and who do I, what do I need to do to make sure that those particular mathematical ideas are things that all the students have access to and are able to master. But another purpose of assessments are to allow school leaders and district leaders to track children's learning, to see how well their policies and practices are working, to make judgments about things like what kind of teacher professional development is needed. Should we consider a different curriculum? So these assessments need to be directly aligned with the standards and provide information on children across the board's progress toward meeting those standards. One thing that I can't stress enough is that teachers need the time and support to use assessment data to plan their instruction. So I have seen so many cases where formative assessments are adopted and teachers are dutifully using them, but even if they're given time to look at them, they don't necessarily know how to address whatever problems might be seen in the assessments. So they often teach the same way over again, and the same kids don't get it the second time around. So there really needs to be supports for teachers to talk about, and sometimes it's just opportunities for them to talk with each other. How are you teaching subtraction with single digits? Because I have a bunch of kids who are just not getting it. And often teachers' own colleagues can be very helpful, but they need that time and opportunity to really reflect on the assessments that they're doing and the information that they're providing. All right, teacher learning. Well, I've sort of touched on this already. There is nothing more important than teacher learning opportunities for if you want to ensure instructional quality and coherence. There are a variety of ways that coherence across grades can be achieved through teacher learning opportunities. One is just professional development that is offered to the preschool through third grade teachers together. It's often true that kindergarten through third grade teachers get professional development together. Preschool is often left off, and there are some really difficult logistic reasons, scheduling and that sort of thing, that make it difficult to include preschool teachers. But if you want to create continuity and coherence between preschool and kindergarten and really capitalize on those gains in preschool, then you need the preschool teachers to have opportunities to learn what the early elementary school teachers are learning. Another way to create greater coherence is to have the same coach work with preschool through the early elementary school teachers. PLCs, where teachers are working collaboratively together, can be useful. Opportunities to collaborate across grades is really critical. Teachers need to know what children are learning in the previous grade and what instructional strategies are being used so that they can build on the previous grade's learning rather than repeat, and so that they can build on it using instructional strategies that children are familiar with and comfortable with. They also need to know what they're preparing children for in the next grade. In fact, the reality is that most teachers are actually teaching at least a 3-year grade span. So a first grade teacher, for example, will have children coming into her first grade who are still working on the kindergarten standards. And she is also likely to have a few children who may come into first grade having already mastered most of the first grade standards. So essentially that first grade teacher is teaching kindergarten through second grade, because that's the span of skill levels and understandings that children come into the classroom with. I think COVID has created this has made the span even larger, because many of the children who are coming into first grade didn't really get a meaningful kindergarten experience. So first grade teachers more than ever are teaching kindergarten and first grade. That means they need to know what the standards are in kindergarten. They need to know what children are learning, what effective instruction looks like, teaching those particular skills. And they need to be able to teach those kids who are in their grade or even above. So that really, I think, provides a strong or compelling argument for making sure that teachers work collaboratively across grades and know what's happening and how it's happening in the grade before and in the grade after. A fifth element is school leader learning. This is especially true as school leaders are increasingly taking on both preschool and, in California, transitional kindergarten, which is just another way of calling preschool. Many of the principals that we worked with don't have backgrounds in early childhood education and don't feel comfortable, or they don't feel like they have the expertise to really provide instructional support in preschool or TK or sometimes even kindergarten. So what districts can offer is some opportunities for them to learn about early childhood education. So I'll just give you an example of one of the districts that we've worked with. They offered an institute with follow-up activities such as classroom walkthroughs that they did with district leaders and especially with the early learning director. They looked at preschool, TK, kindergarten classrooms, and they specifically looked at it through the lens of the instructional framework that this district had developed of what they considered their high leverage, effective instructional strategies. What we found is that the principals who experienced the institute and the walkthroughs and some of the other support related to early childhood education had a much stronger sense of responsibility for the preschool and TK, a stronger sense of ownership, and they were much more engaged as instructional leaders with the earliest grades, with the teachers of the youngest children. So the final element that I want to talk about is instructional oversight. This refers to the ways in which leaders monitor instruction. Instructional walkthroughs are one way. They provide district leaders an opportunity to see what's actually going on in classrooms. They can look at what's going on in classrooms through the lens, again, of what they expect to find, what is part of their instructional framework. There are other kinds of ways that instructional oversight can occur. One is just doing having routines for analyzing data on student performance, analyzing them, discussing them, and considering the implications for the policies and practices that they are promoting. So they may find that even though they have given teachers opportunities to learn particular approaches to instruction, they've articulated a clear instructional framework, kids their math skills don't seem to be improving in the way that they would expect. So then the question is, what's actually going on? And walkthroughs in classrooms might help them figure out whether the instructional practices that they're promoting are actually being implemented in the classroom. So important questions that I think are useful to ask are, do the instructional oversight activities relate to instructional effectiveness and coherence? Are they actually looking, for example, when they're doing walkthroughs for coherence in instructional approaches across the classrooms? Do they include preschool? And often preschool is kind of off on the side and it's not included. But if you want coherence, then you really need to include it in whatever your instructional oversight processes are. How well do administrators at different levels and in different divisions, for example, the early childhood education division or early childhood leaders and the subject matter specialists, communicate? And we have seen many districts, particularly larger districts, where they're kind of on different tracks. And so teachers in maybe kindergarten through third grade are getting different advice, different messages than the teachers who are under the early childhood division are getting from the early childhood leaders. Are individuals with expertise in early education and subject matter teaching included in the decision making related to instruction? And often, again, the early education division is off on the side and is not part of decisions about the school and policies that could affect them. So one of the strategies that I've seen that seems to work pretty well is just to have the early learning director on the superintendent's advisory board or cabinet or whatever it's called, to make sure that the early learning director is privy to decisions and what's going on in the later grades, and the folks who have responsibility for the later grades also have information and communication with the early learning folks. Now, I've talked about these as though they were completely independent. If you just do these 6 things well, you're fine. But actually, what's just as important as thinking about these different elements of coherence, P3, is how well they work with each other, whether they are mutually supportive. So just a few questions. For example, is the teacher learning and the school leader learning aligned with the curriculum? And I mentioned before that I have seen some pretty significant examples of misalignment. And sometimes the school leaders don't even know what the teacher learning is about. And so if they aren't part of the teacher learning opportunities, then they may not be observing, giving feedback, and so on in a way that is consistent with those learning opportunities. Is instructional oversight aligned with the instructional framework? When the people from the district office do walkthroughs in classrooms, are they looking for the particular instructional strategies that they have articulated in the instructional framework? Are instructional materials, pedagogical approaches, and student assessments aligned with each other? So, for example, if the district is promoting deep understanding of math, then are they assessing deep understanding of math, or are they assessing more superficial skills? So all of these things need to be aligned with each other. So when you are asking questions within each of these elements, then you have to say, how do they connect with each other? How do they support each other? How do they align with each other? And that's a lot. I'm going to end there. I just want to mention one other thing before I take down my slides, which is a resource that has been developed by some colleagues that I work with, that is substantially for this whole issue of P3 coherence, but also about effective strategies for teaching mathematics, particularly in preschool, but also in the early elementary grades. And there are videos, there are blogs, there are strategies to engage parents. There's a whole bunch of stuff. So I'm just going to leave that up for a minute in case anybody wants to copy it down, although I think my slides are going to be made available. But it's a good resource that I wanted to make sure people knew was available to them. And I'm going to stop there. So I think it's time for questions. Are there any questions?
Yeah, I think there were a couple in the chat.
Let's see, the question, if I'm reading it correctly, I can't see the beginning of it, but it's something about children moving from classroom A to classroom B strategies that you might recommend. I guess I don't get the question. Can somebody read this to me, because I can't see the whole question? Thank you. Mhm. Uh, yeah, I get asked that question a lot, and I'm going to punt because there's a lot of curriculum changes that are going on now. So I think I would really recommend that you look at curriculum that are out there, see how it aligns with the vision of the district. One thing I want to say about curriculum is we often think of it as a kind of prescriptive, sort of like a recipe for a cake, where you just follow the curriculum. I see curriculum as much more of a general guide of the sequencing, for example, of learning. It's more like not a cake, but a recipe for a stew, where you have a lot of flexibility and you can put whatever's in your refrigerator or whatever you like. So I think most curriculum, some are more difficult than others to teach, what I call classroom bees teaching strategies. But I think if you look at them, you'll know really right away. And I don't want to get into I'll get in trouble if I start recommending particular curriculum. Okay, I'm having trouble seeing the question, so if somebody could tell me if there are any others. Okay, all right, no other questions? Either it was just so clear that you don't need any follow-up, or didn't make sense to you, so you can't think of a good question to ask. Okay.
Okay, so we got another question, and it says, with grade level teams feeling burdened with the gap bulging due to the pandemic, how do you approach a P to third grade alignment with success?
So I think I'm assuming that you're saying you have grade level team meetings and that they are really burdened. There's so much to do in those grade level meetings because you're dealing with the aftermath of COVID. And I think we're all pretending that it's over, but at least we'll call it the aftermath, that it's hard to find time to do what you might call as vertical meetings. Time is always the biggest problem, the biggest challenge in teaching and in schooling. I think a lot of schools will do something like have a grade level team meeting 2 or 3 times a month, and then once a month have a cross grade level meeting, sometimes on a particular subject matter, whether it's literacy or math or whatever. So I know that many of you are struggling, and this is a really hard time to be a teacher. But ultimately, if you want to have coherence across the grades, you need to know what's going on in the other grades. And so finding a way to do that is just it may be aspirational, but it's something to aspire to. And I think you'd be surprised with how much you can learn from teachers in the grade below and above you, because many of the struggles that you're having, particularly first grade teachers who are finding so many kids had not had kindergarten, they're really struggling with the same thing that the kindergarten teachers are struggling with. So in some respects, they might benefit more from talking to other kindergarten teachers than to talking to first grade teachers. So there are real benefits. I just recommend trying to organize the teacher collaboration time so there at least is a monthly opportunity to do cross-grade level groupings.
There was another question.
Yeah.
It says, where might you start at aligning curriculum, assessments, and trainings?
Where might you start aligning?
Curriculum, assessments, and trainings.
As though you can do one and then follow that with the other. I think I would start with the teacher training because that's where you're going to get some important instructional changes and improvements. But that is likely to reveal some inconsistencies between what the teachers are being told in the training and what their curriculum looks like. So then they're not going to need some help in navigating what they've learned in the training and what the curriculum is asking for. One thing we know is that training that is done in workshops, like a 2-hour workshop or even a whole day workshop, and sometimes even a whole weekend workshop, is not effective. It doesn't affect the way teachers teach. They often learn things in the workshop that seem really cool. They go back to their classroom, they try them out. They didn't work the way it worked in the workshop or in the video that they watched, and so they go back to teaching the way they did before. What the research shows is that teachers need that ongoing support. So workshops are fine to introduce new teaching practices, but they either need a coach or they need colleagues, or they need a strong instructional leader in their principal who is going to help them actually implement that instruction that they learned in their classroom with their kids, with their specific needs and resources. I see some of the questions here, but I can't read them.
No worries, I got you. So then we have another question here that says, is it detrimental for children moving from a class B to a class A?
Well, first of all, we don't want any class A's. It's just not good instruction. I think there's two issues. One is it's going from good instruction to bad instruction. So that's obviously not what we aspire to. The second is the child is having to learn a whole new way of doing math. So the child's used to problem solving. They're used to trying to figure out solutions on their own or with a peer. And they go into a classroom and the teacher says, here's how you solve this problem. Just do exactly what I tell you to do. Frankly, and I'm sorry to say this, is that I find kids actually adapt to that fairly well, sometimes more easily than the reverse direction. But who wants kids to go from good instruction to bad instruction? So even though they may adapt to it fairly quickly, it's not what I would recommend. And you're losing all the gains you made with effective instruction. Here you've got kids who see math as opportunities to solve problems, of opportunities to bring themselves to the problems, to make sense of problems. And then you tell them, no, math isn't like that at all. Well, math is like that. And it's much more engaging and much more fun to do it that way.
There's another question. It says, how do you help a child who shows delay in learning? Example, not able to remember no's or forget certain no's. In counting by route, not able to remember names of shapes, etc.
Most children will get it with support. And essentially the strategy is wherever the child is, you take them to, you keep working on what they need to be working on. Now, there are unusually some children who really have special needs and need special tutoring or support. And many schools have resources to be able to do that. Don't jump to that, because sometimes children just take a little longer to get it. So patience is called for. And don't give up on the child, because you don't want the child to give up on him or herself. There also may be other issues in that child's life. There may be some emotional issues that the child's dealing with that just get in the way of thinking clearly. And sometimes meetings with parents or caregivers can help you understand what the child's issues are. If there are emotional issues, then they may need to be dealt with directly. But mostly it's just children take a little longer. Some children take a little longer. I see something is there going to be an alignment across the state? I don't see the beginning of it.
There's a question that says, is there a statewide support group for administrators for P3 math alignment?
Oh, that's a really good question. I know that the state in California has made a commitment to P3 continuity, but they haven't necessarily put resources behind that. I work with an organization called Ed Partners. Ed Partners works with districts on an ongoing basis for 3 years to help them develop P3 continuity, either in math, and then we have another group of districts that we work with to help them develop continuity and excellence in literacy. So there are organizations that do that kind of work. So one task is finding them. We are working with some counties. Some county offices are beginning to develop resources. I would suggest checking with the county office. The other thing that can be done is to seize the opportunity yourselves and identify a couple of other districts that you work well with, and then work collaboratively to try to work on some of these issues that you all are facing in creating P3 continuity. So, I think I'm just going to say the introduction of TK in California has really pushed this P3 continuity issue on the agenda more than it has been on before, because now you've got kids, preschool, transitional kindergarten, that are very closely aligned, and I think a lot of districts are trying to figure out how to make sure there's continuity in children's experiences through those.
I think we have time for one more question. Someone asked, what are specific effective strategies for preschoolers that are behind in math?
You don't use a different strategy if they're behind. You use the strategy that you would use that has been shown to be effective for children who are developing the skill that you're trying to teach. So whether they're behind or way above, if they're learning to count to 20, they're learning to count to 20. So you use whatever strategy is effective in helping children learn the particular skill that they need to learn. And I think our time is out. So I hope this has been useful. It's been a pleasure to interact with you, and I wish you all the best.